The wildflowers bent beneath her fingers like prayers whispered to the earth. And Deputy Marshal Dorian Pierce knew the moment he saw her kneeling in that meadow that his carefully ordered life was about to unravel in the most unexpected way. It was June 1883 in Chico, California, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley floor where the woman gathered blossoms with a concentration that seemed almost sacred. Dorian had been tracking a horse thief through the countryside when he spotted her, a splash of pale blue fabric against the golden grass, her dark auburn hair escaping its pins as she reached for a cluster of California poppies. He pulled his mount to a stop at the edge of the meadow, leather creaking softly as he dismounted. The woman had not heard his approach, too absorbed in her task, her fingers moving delicately among the stems as she hummed a melody he could not quite place. For a moment, Dorian simply watched her, transfixed by the simple beauty of the scene, by the way she seemed to belong to this wild landscape in a way he had never quite managed despite his years working these territories. When his boot snapped a dry twig, her head jerked up, eyes wide with alarm. They were the color of honey in sunlight, those eyes, and they held his gaze with a mixture of fear and defiance that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. "I did not mean to startle you, miss," Dorian said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. The deputy marshal badge pinned to his vest caught the light, and he saw her eyes flick to it briefly before returning to his face. "I am Deputy Marshal Dorian Pierce. I have been tracking someone through this area and wanted to make certain you were safe out here alone." The woman rose slowly, clutching her basket of wildflowers against her chest like a shield. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 20 or 21, with a face that showed signs of hardship despite her youth. Her dress, though clean and carefully mended, had seen better days, and her boots were worn nearly through at the toes. "I am fine, Deputy Marshal," she said, her voice soft but steady. There was a hint of an accent he could not quite place, something Eastern perhaps. "I did not realize I was trespassing. I will go." "You are not trespassing," Dorian assured her, taking a careful step closer. His horse nickered softly behind him. "This is open land. I was only concerned for your welfare. There are rough men who pass through these parts, and a woman alone is vulnerable." Something flickered across her face at those words, something that looked like bitter understanding. She glanced down at her basket, then back at him. "I am gathering flowers to sell in town, for medicines and dyes. Mrs. Henderson at the general store sometimes buys them from me." Dorian nodded, recognizing the name. "Martha Henderson is a good woman. How far did you walk from town?" 5 miles, perhaps," the woman said. She seemed to be relaxing slightly, though her shoulders remained tense. "I am staying at the boarding house on 3rd Street. Mrs. Carlyle allows me to work from my room when I cannot afford the rent." 5 miles was a considerable distance to walk in the California heat, especially for someone who looked as though she had not eaten a proper meal in some time. Dorian made a decision that surprised even himself. "Let me give you a ride back to town. My horse can easily carry 2 and it is getting late. The mountain lions come down to hunt at dusk." He saw her hesitation, the way she weighed his offer against whatever experiences had taught her to be cautious of strangers. Finally, she gave a small nod. "That is kind of you, Deputy Marshal. Thank you, Dorian," he said, offering his hand to help her over the uneven ground. "You can call me Dorian." Her hand was small in his, roughened by work but still somehow delicate. "Julia," she said after a moment. "Julia Davenport." The ride back to Chico was quiet at first. Julia perched carefully behind him on the saddle, her basket balanced on her lap. Dorian was intensely aware of her presence, the way she held herself slightly away from him to maintain propriety, the the faint scent of wildflowers that seemed to surround her. He found himself searching for something to say, wanting to hear her voice again. "How long have you been in Chico, Miss Davenport?" he asked as they followed the dirt road toward town. "3 months," Julia replied. "I came from Kansas City. There was nothing left for me there after my father died." "I am sorry for your loss," Dorian said and meant it. He knew something about loss himself, though he rarely spoke of it. "Thank you." Her voice was quiet. "He was a good man, a teacher. He taught me everything he knew about plants and their properties. That is how I know which flowers to gather, which ones can heal, and which ones are only beautiful." Dorian guided his horse around a deep rut in the road. "That is valuable knowledge. There is not a proper doctor within 50 miles of Chico. People could use someone with your skills." He felt her shift slightly behind him. "I am not a doctor. I only know what my father taught me. Simple remedies, nothing more." "That is still more than most," Dorian said. The town was coming into view now, the scattered buildings that made up Chico's main street visible in the distance. The sun was lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Have you thought about opening a proper shop, selling your medicines alongside the flowers?" Julia laughed, a sound tinged with sadness. "That requires money I do not have, Deputy Marshal. Right now I am simply trying to earn enough to keep a roof over my head and food in my stomach." Dreams of shops and security seem very far away. Something in her words struck a chord deep in Dorian's chest. He had seen so many people pass through Chico over his years as deputy marshal, drifters and fortune seekers, people running from their pasts or chasing uncertain futures. But there was something different about Julia Davenport, something that made him want to know more, to help if he could. They reached the boarding house just as the street lamps were being lit. Dorian dismounted first, then helped Julia down, his hands steady on her waist. She looked up at him for a moment, and in the gathering twilight, he saw vulnerability in her eyes that made him want to promise her things he had no business promising. "Thank you for the ride, Dorian," she said, his name sounding almost musical in her voice. "It was very kind of you." "It was my pleasure," he replied, reluctantly releasing her. "May I ask something of you, Miss Davenport?" She tilted her head slightly, curious. "Of course. I would like to see you again. Perhaps I could call on you, take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant." He saw surprise flash across her face, followed by something that looked like hope before her expression shuddered. "I do not think that would be appropriate, Deputy Marshal. I am not in a position to be courted. I have nothing to offer anyone." "That is not true," Dorian said firmly. "And I am not asking for you to offer me anything. I am simply asking for the pleasure of your company, a meal between friends if nothing else. You need to eat, and I eat alone most nights. We could remedy both situations." Julia studied him for a long moment, and Dorian held his breath, surprised by how much her answer mattered to him. This woman he had known for less than 2 hours had somehow already worked her way under his skin, and he was not entirely sure how to feel about that. "One dinner," Julia finally said. "But only if you promise not to pity me. I may be poor, but I still have my pride." Dorian smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. "I do not pity you, Julia Davenport. I admire you. Tomorrow evening, I will call for you at 6. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Tomorrow at 6. He watched her disappear into the boarding house, her basket of wildflowers still clutched in her arms, before mounting his horse and heading toward his own small house on the edge of town. As he rode, Dorian found himself thinking about auburn hair and honey-colored eyes, about small hands that knew how to coax beauty from the earth, about a voice that held sadness and strength in equal measure. He had been alone for 3 years, ever since his wife, Sarah, had died giving birth to their stillborn son. The loss had nearly destroyed him, had made him retreat into his work and away from any emotional connections that might risk that kind of pain again. But something about Julia had reached through his carefully constructed walls, had reminded him that life was meant to be lived, not just endured. The next evening found Dorian standing outside the boarding house at precisely 6 o'clock, wearing his best shirt and jacket, his hair still damp from washing. His palms were actually sweating, which was ridiculous for a man of 26 who had faced down outlaws and survived more dangerous situations than he could count. But the thought of disappointing Julia, of saying the wrong thing and watching that guarded look return to her eyes, made him more nervous than any gunfight ever had. Mrs. Carlyle answered his knock, her sharp eyes taking in his appearance with obvious approval. She was a widow who ran the boarding house with an iron fist and a kind heart, known throughout Chico for taking in women who had nowhere else to go. "Deputy Marshal Pierce," she said warmly. "Julia said you would be calling. She is just finishing up. Come in, come in." The boarding house parlor was modestly furnished but clean, with lace curtains at the windows and a vase of wildflowers on the side table. Dorian recognized several of the blooms from the meadow where he had found Julia the day before. He was studying them when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Julia appeared in the doorway wearing the same blue dress from yesterday. But she had done something different with her hair, pulling it back in a way that highlighted the fine bones of her face and the graceful line of her neck. She had clearly made an effort, and Dorian found himself momentarily speechless. "You look lovely," he managed finally, and was rewarded with a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you," Julia said, accepting the arm he offered. "You clean up rather well yourself, Deputy Marshal." The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Chico, which admittedly was not saying much, but it had clean tablecloths and a decent cook. Dorian had made sure to reserve a table by the window, where they could watch the town settling into evening while they ate. Julia's eyes widened when she saw the menu, and Dorian realized with a pang that she probably had not eaten at a restaurant in a very long time, if ever. "Order anything you like," he said gently. "I promise you, the deputy marshal's salary is more than adequate for a good meal." She chose the roast chicken with vegetables, and Dorian ordered the same, along with fresh bread and apple pie for dessert. As they waited for their food, he found himself telling her about his work, about the challenges of keeping the peace in a growing town where gold fever and cattle money sometimes brought out the worst in people. "It must be difficult," Julia said, her fingers toying with her napkin. "Being responsible for everyone's safety. How did you come to be a deputy marshal?" Dorian leaned back in his chair, considering his answer. "I grew up in Texas on a ranch. My father raised horses and cattle. I always thought I would do the same, follow in his footsteps. But when I was 19, a gang of rustlers came through. They killed my father when he tried to stop them from taking our herd. I tracked them for 3 weeks and brought them to justice. The marshal who handled the case said I had a talent for it, offered to train me. I have been wearing a badge ever since." He saw sympathy in Julia's eyes, but not pity, and he was grateful for that. "So you understand about loss," she said softly, "about having your life change in ways you never expected." "Yes," Dorian agreed. "I understand that very well." Their food arrived, and for a while they ate in comfortable silence. Dorian watched Julia savor each bite, clearly making an effort not to eat too quickly despite what was obviously real hunger. The sight made his chest ache with a protective instinct he had not felt in years. "Tell me about your father," he said. "You said he was a teacher." Julia's face softened at the mention of her father. "He taught literature and natural sciences at a school in Kansas City." My mother died when I was very young, so it was always just the two of us. He was wonderful, always patient, always eager to share what he knew. We would take long walks and he would point out different plants, tell me their names and properties. He said knowledge was the most valuable thing anyone could possess because it could never be taken away. He sounds like a wise man, Dorian said. He was. Julia set down her fork, her expression growing sad. He contracted pneumonia last winter. I tried everything I knew to help him, but nothing worked. He died in February, and suddenly I was alone. The school provided our housing, so I had to leave. I had a little money from selling his books and possessions, enough to buy passage west. I had heard that California was full of opportunity, but when I arrived I realized I had no skills that anyone wanted to pay for. I have been barely surviving ever since. Dorian reached across the table and took her hand without thinking. You have skills, Julia. You just need the chance to use them properly. What if I helped you set up that shop we talked about? I have some money saved. I could lend it to you and you could pay me back once the business is established. Julia pulled her hand away, shaking her head. I could not accept that. I barely know you. Why would you risk your money on a stranger? Because I believe in you, Dorian said simply. And because you are not a stranger anymore. You are someone I care about and want to help. She stared at him, her honey-colored eyes wide with surprise and something else, something that looked like dawning hope. We met yesterday, Dorian. People do not develop feelings that quickly. Do they not? He leaned forward, holding her gaze. I knew the moment I saw you in that meadow that you were special. Call it instinct, call it fate, call it whatever you want. I only know that I want to see you succeed. I want to see you bloom the way those wildflowers do under your care. Julia was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. No one has ever offered me something like this. No one has ever believed in me this way except my father. I do not know what to say. Say you will think about it, Dorian suggested. You do not have to decide tonight, just consider the possibility. I will think about it, Julia agreed softly. Then, after a pause, why are you really doing this, Dorian? What do you want from me? It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. Dorian took a breath. 3 years ago, I lost my wife and child. I have been going through the motions of living ever since, but not really feeling anything. Then I saw you yesterday, and suddenly I felt alive again. I am not asking for anything from you, Julia. I am offering because helping you helps me too. It gives me purpose beyond just my badge. Does that make sense? Yes, Julia said, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. Yes, it makes perfect sense. They finished their meal in a lighter mood, talking about easier subjects. Julia told him about the different wildflowers that grew in the area, their uses and meanings. Dorian shared stories about his travels across California, the beautiful and dangerous places he had seen. By the time they left the restaurant, the sky was dark and full of stars, and Dorian felt more content than he had in years. He walked Julia back to the boarding house, taking the long route so they could enjoy the evening air. When they reached her door, she turned to face him, her expression serious in the lamplight. Thank you for tonight, she said. For the meal, for the conversation, for believing in me. I have been alone for so long, barely holding on. You have given me something I had almost forgotten about. What is that? Dorian asked. Hope, Julia said simply. Before he could respond, she stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, a brief touch that nevertheless sent warmth flooding through him. Then she was gone, slipping through the door with a soft good night, leaving him standing on the porch with his hand pressed to where her lips had been. Dorian walked home through the quiet streets of Chico, his mind full of auburn hair and honey eyes and possibilities he had not dared to consider in years. He was falling in love with Julia Davenport, had probably been falling since the moment he saw her kneeling among the wildflowers. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Dorian could not stop thinking about Julia, could not stop wanting to see her. He found excuses to visit the general store when he knew she would be there selling her flowers. He arranged his patrol routes to pass through the meadows where she gathered her blooms. He called at the boarding house with increasing frequency, taking Julia to dinner, on walks, on buggy rides through the countryside. Julia seemed to bloom under his attention, just as he had predicted. The guarded look in her eyes gradually softened. She smiled more readily, laughed more freely. The tension that had kept her shoulders tight began to ease. She told him more about her life, about her dreams of establishing herself, about her fears that she would never be more than a charity case at Mrs. Carlyle's boarding house. For his part, Dorian found himself opening up in ways he had not expected. He told Julia about Sarah, about the guilt he still carried over not being home when she went into labor, about the darkness that had consumed him in the months after their deaths. Julia listened without judgment, her presence a balm to wounds he had thought would never heal. One evening in late July, Dorian took Julia back to the meadow where he had first found her. The wildflowers were in full bloom, carpeting the ground in gold and purple and white. They spread a blanket and watched the sunset, sharing cold chicken and bread that Dorian had purchased from the hotel kitchen. "I have made a decision," Julia said, lying back on the blanket to watch the clouds drift overhead, "about your offer to help me open a shop." Dorian's heart began to pound. "And I want to accept," Julia said. "Not as a loan, but as a partnership. You provide the initial capital and I provide the knowledge and work. We split the profits until you have been paid back and then we renegotiate terms. That way it is fair to both of us." "Julia, that is not necessary," Dorian started, but she cut him off. "It is necessary to me. I will not be a charity case, not even for you. Especially not for you. If we are going to do this, we do it as equals." He could hear the steel in her voice, the pride that had kept her going through months of hardship. It was one of the things he loved most about her. "All right," he agreed. "Partners it is." Julia sat up, turning to face him. The setting sun painted her face in gold, making her eyes glow. "There is something else I need to say." "What is it?" She took a deep breath. "I have feelings for you, Dorian, strong feelings. I have been fighting them because I told myself I could not afford to fall in love when my life was so uncertain, but I cannot fight it anymore, and I do not want to. You have given me so much, been so patient and kind. You make me want to hope again, to dream again. I think I am falling in love with you." Dorian felt as though all the air had been knocked from his lungs. He had hoped, had suspected, but hearing the words made everything real in a way that took his breath away. "Julia," he said, reaching for her hand. "I am already in love with you. I have been for weeks. I was just waiting for the right moment to tell you. Is this the right moment?" She asked, a smile playing at her lips. "It is the perfect moment," he said, and kissed her. The kiss was everything Dorian had imagined and more. Julia's lips were soft against his, her hand coming up to cup his cheek as she kissed him back. It was tender and sweet and full of promise, a beginning rather than an end. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Dorian rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said again, needing to hear the words out loud. "I love your strength and your kindness and your determination. I love the way you see beauty in simple things like wildflowers. I love how you have taken what life threw at you and kept going anyway. I want to build a life with you if you will have me." "I will have you," Julia said, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you too, Dorian Pierce. More than I thought possible. They stayed in the meadow until full dark, talking about their plans for the shop, about the future they would build together. Dorian told her about his house on the edge of town, how it had been empty and silent for too long. Julia told him about her dreams of having a garden where she could grow medicinal herbs alongside the flowers. They wove their hopes together like a tapestry, creating something beautiful from the threads of their individual lives. The next month was a whirlwind of activity. With Dorian's financial backing and connections, they found a small storefront on Main Street that was perfect for Julia's needs. It had a large front room for the shop itself and living quarters in the back, along with a small yard where Julia could start her herb garden. The rent was reasonable, and the landlord was willing to make some improvements in exchange for a longer lease. Julia threw herself into preparing the shop with an energy that was infectious. Dorian found himself spending every free moment helping her, building shelves, painting walls, hauling supplies. The other townspeople began to take notice of their relationship, and while there were some raised eyebrows at the speed of their courtship, most seemed genuinely happy for them. Mrs. Carlyle was particularly pleased, telling anyone who would listen that she had known from the start that the deputy marshal and her boarder were perfect for each other. Martha Henderson at the general store proved to be an unexpected ally. She had watched Julia struggling to make ends meet over the previous months, and was delighted to see her getting a real chance. She spread the word about the upcoming shop, recommending Julia's remedies to her customers, and even helped Julia make contact with other shop owners who might be interested in carrying her products. On the 1st of September, 1883, Julia's shop officially opened. They had named it Davenport Botanicals, and the front window was full of carefully arranged wildflowers and bottles of tinctures and salves. Julia had sewn new curtains for the windows and painted a sign herself, her careful handwriting advertising remedies for everything from headaches to joint pain to sleeplessness. The opening day exceeded all expectations. Women came to buy flowers for their homes and stayed to purchase medicines. Men came seeking treatments for aches and pains they had been ignoring for years. Julia moved through the shop with confidence, explaining her products, offering advice, her knowledge and genuine care for people's welfare evident in every interaction. Dorian watched from his post by the door, officially there to provide security but really just wanting to witness Julia's triumph. She glowed with happiness and pride, and he felt his heart swell with love for her. This was what she had been meant to do, who she had been meant to be. He was honored to have played a part in making it happen. When the last customer finally left and Julia locked the door behind them, she turned to Dorian with tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "It actually worked." Dorian crossed the shop in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. "You did it," he corrected gently. "This is your success, Julia. Your knowledge, your hard work. I just helped clear the path." "You did more than that," she insisted, pulling back to look up at him. "You believed in me when I did not believe in myself. You gave me the tools to succeed, but more than that, you gave me the courage to try. I would still be barely surviving at the boarding house if not for you. And I would still be going through the motions of living without really feeling anything if not for you," Dorian replied. "We saved each other, I think." Julia smiled through her tears. "I like that idea." "Good," Dorian said, "because I have something I want to ask you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Julia's eyes went wide as he dropped to one knee in the middle of her shop, surrounded by wildflowers and bottles of medicine. "Julia Davenport, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You have brought light and joy and purpose back into my life. You have reminded me what it means to truly live. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond, all he could afford but chosen with care. Julia stared at it for a long moment before raising her tear-filled eyes to his face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Dorian slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and kissed her deeply, pouring all his love and hope and joy into that kiss. Julia kissed him back with equal passion, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressed against his. When they finally broke apart, both slightly dizzy, Dorian laughed with pure happiness. "When?" he asked. "How soon can we be married?" "As soon as you like," Julia said, her smile radiant. "Tomorrow if we could, though I suppose that is not practical." "Next month," Dorian suggested. "That gives us time to plan properly, to notify people." "Next month is perfect," Julia agreed. They were married on the first Saturday in October, in a small ceremony at the church on the edge of town. The entire population of Chico seemed to turn out for the wedding, filling the pews to capacity. Mrs. Carlyle cried through the entire service. Martha Henderson had organized a reception at the hotel. Even the mayor made an appearance, giving a speech about how love and enterprise were the foundations of a strong community. Julia wore a cream-colored dress that she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers, naturally, including California poppies from the meadow where they had first met. Dorian wore his best suit, though he felt stiff and awkward in it compared to his usual work clothes. But when Julia walked down the aisle and he saw the love shining in her honey-colored eyes, all his nervousness melted away. The ceremony itself was simple, but meaningful. They exchanged vows promising to love and honor each other, to be partners in all things, to face whatever challenges life brought them together. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Dorian kissed his bride, he felt a sense of completeness he had never experienced before. This was right. This was what he had been meant to find. The reception was a joyful affair, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible. Dorian danced with Julia until his feet hurt, not wanting to let her go, wanting to hold on to this moment of pure happiness forever. Julia laughed and smiled until her cheeks hurt, accepting congratulations and well wishes from what seemed like everyone in town. As the evening wore on and the party began to wind down, Dorian and Julia slipped away to the house he had been preparing for weeks. He had cleaned it thoroughly, made repairs, even hired a woman to sew new curtains and bedding. He wanted everything to be perfect for Julia, wanted her to feel immediately at home. When he carried her over the threshold, she gasped with delight at the sight of wildflowers everywhere, filling vases on every surface. "When did you do this?" she asked, her eyes shining. "This morning," Dorian admitted. "I wanted to surprise you. I know how much you love them." "I love you," Julia said, pulling him down for a kiss. "Thank you for making everything so perfect." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a joining of not just bodies but hearts and souls. Dorian was gentle with Julia, mindful that this was new territory for her, and she responded to him with a trust and openness that humbled him. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Julia's head on his chest, her hair spread across his shoulder like silk. "Are you happy?" Dorian asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare skin. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Julia replied. "I keep thinking I am going to wake up and discover this was all a dream, that I am still at the boarding house, struggling to survive, and none of this is real." "It is real," Dorian assured her. "I am real. This is real. We are married and we are going to build a beautiful life together." "I believe you," Julia said, pressing a kiss to his chest. "I love you so much, Dorian." "I love you too," he replied, tightening his arms around her. more than I can ever properly express." They drifted off to sleep wrapped in each other's arms, and Dorian's last thought before sleep claimed him was that he was the luckiest man alive. The first months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Julia divided her time between the shop and the house, trying to find a balance that allowed her to run her business while also being a wife. Dorian continued his work as deputy marshal, though he found himself rushing through his duties so he could get home to Julia sooner. They had their first real argument in November, over something ridiculous that Dorian could barely remember later. Something about Julia working too hard and not taking care of herself properly. It escalated quickly, both of them saying things they did not entirely mean, until Julia burst into tears and Dorian felt like the worst husband in the world. "I am sorry," he said, pulling her into his arms despite her half-hearted resistance. "I am so sorry. I should not have pushed you. I know how much the shop means to you." "I am sorry too," Julia said against his chest. "I know you are only concerned for my welfare. I am just not used to having someone care about me that way. I keep forgetting that I do not have to do everything alone anymore." "You do not," Dorian confirmed. "We are a team now, remember? Partners in everything. That means we help each other, support each other. It also means we need to communicate better, not let things build up until we explode." Julia nodded, wiping her eyes. "You are right. I should have told you. I was feeling overwhelmed instead of trying to handle it all myself." They talked for hours that night, really talked, about their expectations and fears and needs. It was the first of many such conversations, laying the foundation for a marriage built on honesty and mutual respect. Dorian came to understand that Julia's need for independence came from years of having to rely only on herself, while Julia learned that accepting help did not make her weak or dependent. December brought their first Christmas together, and Julia threw herself into decorating the house with evergreen branches and holly berries. She baked cookies and pies, filling the house with warm scents that reminded Dorian of his childhood. On Christmas morning, he woke to find her curled against him, a small smile on her sleeping face, and felt overwhelming gratitude for the gift of her presence in his life. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Pierce," he whispered when her eyes fluttered open. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Pierce," she replied, stretching lazily. "I have a present for you." "You did not need to get me anything," Dorian protested, though he was secretly pleased. "You are gift enough." "Too bad. I got you something anyway," Julia said, sitting up and reaching for a package wrapped in brown paper that she had hidden under the bed. "Open it." Inside was a beautiful leather journal, the cover embossed with his initials. Dorian ran his fingers over it reverently. "Julia, this is too much." "No, it is not," she said firmly. "You have so many stories from your travels, from your work. I thought you might like to write some of them down. Our children will want to know about their father's adventures someday." The casual mention of children made Dorian's heart skip a beat. They had talked about wanting a family, but hearing Julia speak of it as a certainty rather than a possibility made it real in a new way. "Our children," he repeated softly. Julia blushed. "I hope that is all right. I know it might seem too soon to be thinking about such things, but I want to have babies with you, Dorian. I want to fill this house with love and laughter." "It is more than all right," Dorian said, setting the journal aside to pull her into his lap. "It is wonderful. I want that too. I want everything with you." "Good," Julia said, kissing him, "because I think we should start trying." That spring brought changes to Chico. The town continued to grow as more people moved west seeking opportunity. New businesses opened on Main Street, including a proper doctor who set up practice 2 doors down from Julia's shop. Far from being threatened by the competition, Julia was delighted to have someone with formal medical training to consult with. Doctor. Edmund Frost proved to be a kind man in his 50s who was impressed by Julia's knowledge and eager to learn from her about botanical remedies. The two formed a professional relationship that benefited both of them. Julia referred more serious cases to Dr. Frost, while he recommended her remedies for minor ailments and preventative care. Together, they were able to provide Chico with better medical care than the town had ever known. Dorian's work as deputy marshal kept him busy as well. There was the usual petty theft and drunken brawls, but also more serious crimes. In March, he tracked down a gang of bandits who had been robbing travelers on the road between Chico and Sacramento. In April, he helped break up a counterfeiting ring operating out of a supposedly legitimate print shop. The work was dangerous and demanding, but Dorian was good at it, and knowing he was making the territory safer for Julia and their future family gave him purpose. In May, Julia discovered she was pregnant. She told Dorian over dinner, so nervous she could barely eat. Dorian's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He whooped with joy, swept her up in his arms, spun her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. Then he set her down carefully as though she were made of glass, his hands going immediately to her still flat stomach. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "As sure as I can be," Julia replied. "I have all the signs. Dr. Frost confirmed it this afternoon. He thinks the baby will come in late December or early January." "A New Year's baby," Dorian said, kneeling down to press his ear against her stomach. "Hello in there, little one. This is your father. I already love you more than I thought possible, and I cannot wait to meet you." Julia laughed, running her fingers through his hair. "I do not think the baby can hear you yet." "Maybe not," Dorian agreed, looking up at her with eyes that shone with unshed tears. "But I wanted to tell them anyway. Thank you, Julia. Thank you for this gift." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Julia suffered from morning sickness for the first few months. Dorian fussed over her constantly, trying to make sure she was eating enough and not working too hard. Julia bore his hovering with good humor, understanding that his protectiveness came from love and from the fear of losing another wife and child. In August, Dorian sat Julia down for a serious conversation. "I want you to promise me something," he said, taking her hands in his. "When it comes time for the baby to be born, if Dr. Frost says there are complications, if he has to choose between you and the baby, I need you to promise that you will tell him to choose you." Julia started to protest, but Dorian continued. "Please, Julia, I lost Sarah and our son. I do not think I could survive losing you too. I love you more than anything, and I need to know that you will fight to stay with me." "I promise," Julia said softly, seeing the fear in his eyes. "I promise I will fight to come back to you, but Dorian, nothing is going to happen. I am healthy and strong, and Dr. Frost is skilled. We are going to be fine." "I know," Dorian said, though he did not sound entirely convinced. "I just needed to hear you say it." As Julia's belly grew round with their child, Dorian found himself falling even more deeply in love with her. She glowed with happiness, one hand constantly resting on her stomach, talking to the baby about everything and nothing. She redecorated the spare bedroom as a nursery, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, preparing for their new arrival with joy and anticipation. The shop continued to thrive, though Julia hired a young woman named Emma to help out as she grew larger and more tired. Emma was 17, the daughter of a local farmer, bright and eager to learn. Julia taught her about the different plants and their uses, and Emma proved to be a quick study. It eased Dorian's mind to know that Julia had help and would not be trying to do everything herself. In December, as Julia's due date approached, Dorian arranged to take time away from his deputy marshal duties. The marshal had assigned him to desk work only, not wanting to risk Dorian being called away on an emergency when his wife needed him. Dorian was grateful for the consideration, though sitting at a desk when he was used to being active made him restless. On December 28th, Julia woke Dorian in the middle of the night, her face tight with pain. "It is time," she said simply. Dorian was out of bed in an instant, pulling on clothes with shaking hands. He helped Julia dress, then ran to fetch Dr. Frost while Mrs. Carlyle, who had agreed to be present for the birth, came to stay with Julia. By the time Dorian returned with the doctor, Julia's contractions were coming regularly, and she was pacing the bedroom, breathing through the pain. The labor was long and difficult. Dorian stayed by Julia's side through all of it, holding her hand, wiping the sweat from her brow, murmuring encouragement even as his own fear threatened to overwhelm him. Julia was so strong, so brave, but he could see the toll the labor was taking on her. Hours passed with no progress, and Dorian saw worry beginning to show in Dr. Frost's eyes. "What is wrong?" he demanded when Julia was between contractions. "Why is this taking so long?" "The baby is in an awkward position," Dr. Frost explained quietly. "I may need to help turn it. It will be painful for Julia, but it is the best chance for both of them to survive this." Dorian felt ice flood his veins. "Do whatever you have to do. Just save her. Save them both if you can, but if you cannot, save Julia, please." Dr. Frost nodded and went back to Julia. Dorian held her as the doctor manipulated her belly, trying to turn the baby. Julia screamed with pain, tears streaming down her face, and Dorian felt each cry like a knife to his heart. But Dr. Frost was skilled, and after what felt like an eternity, he stepped back with satisfaction. "The baby is in position now," he announced. "It should go more quickly from here." He was right. Within another hour, Julia gave one final push and their child entered the world with a lusty cry. Dr. Frost held up the squalling infant with a smile. "Congratulations," he said. "You have a son." A son. Dorian stared at the tiny, red-faced creature in wonder, hardly able to believe that this perfect being had come from him and Julia. Dr. Frost cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a blanket before placing him in Julia's arms. She looked down at their child with a smile of pure love, all the pain forgotten in the joy of holding her baby. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Dorian sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Julia, one finger touching their son's impossibly small hand. The baby gripped his finger reflexively, and Dorian felt his heart expand with love so intense it was almost painful. This was his family, his wife and son, the most precious things in his world. "What should we name him?" Julia asked, looking up at Dorian. They had discussed names but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son's face, Dorian knew. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Edward Pierce, after my father, if that is all right with you." "It is perfect," Julia said, kissing their son's forehead. "Daniel Edward Pierce." "Welcome to the world, Danny." The first weeks with a newborn were exhausting but wonderful. Daniel was a good baby, only fussing when he was hungry or needed changing. Julia took to motherhood naturally, though Dorian could see the toll that sleepless nights and constant feeding took on her. He helped as much as he could, changing diapers, walking the floor with Daniel when he cried, letting Julia rest whenever possible. Emma proved invaluable, running the shop during Julia's maternity leave, and even coming by the house to help with the baby so Julia could get some sleep. The women of Chico rallied around them as well, bringing food and supplies, offering advice and assistance. Dorian was touched by the support, by how the community had embraced them. By the time Daniel was 3 months old, Julia felt ready to return to the shop part-time. They arranged for Mrs. Carlyle to watch Daniel during Julia's working hours, and a routine gradually emerged that worked for everyone. Dorian took over evening baby duty, giving Julia time to rest after her days at the shop. It was hectic and tiring, but they were happy. Daniel grew quickly, becoming a chubby, cheerful baby who smiled at everyone. He had Dorian's dark hair and Julia's honey-colored eyes, and Dorian thought he was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Every milestone was cause for celebration. The first time Daniel smiled. The first time he laughed. The first time he rolled over. Dorian and Julia documented it all, marveling at how their son was growing and changing. When Daniel was 6 months old, Dorian came home from work one evening to find Julia in the nursery, rocking their son with a thoughtful expression. "Is everything all right?" he asked, concerned. "Everything is wonderful," Julia assured him. "I was just thinking about how much our lives have changed. A year and a half ago, I was alone and struggling, wondering if I would even survive. Now I have a husband I adore, a thriving business, and the most perfect baby in the world. It feels like a miracle." Dorian crossed the room and wrapped his arms around both of them. "You are the miracle, Julia. You took the chances I offered and turned them into something amazing." "You did that, not me. We did it together," Julia corrected, leaning back against him. "We make a good team, Dorian Pierce." "The best team," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. The years that followed were good ones. Chico continued to grow and prosper, and so did the Pierce family. Julia's shop expanded into the building next door, and she hired 2 more employees to help manage the increased business. She wrote a small book about botanical remedies that was published by a press in Sacramento and became popular throughout California. Dr. Frost continued to be a valuable colleague and became a good friend as well. Dorian's career advanced too. When the Marshal retired in 1886, Dorian was offered the position. He accepted, though it meant more administrative work and less time in the field. But it also meant more time at home with Julia and Daniel, and that was worth any sacrifice. Daniel grew into an intelligent, curious child who loved exploring the world around him. He spent hours in his mother's garden, learning about plants the way she had learned from her father. He tagged along with Dorian whenever possible, proud of his father's badge and important work. Watching his son grow brought Dorian joy beyond measure. In the fall of 1888, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in May of 1889, she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth, after Dorian's first wife and Julia's mother. Baby Sarah had auburn hair like her mother and a serious expression that made Dorian smile. Daniel, now 4 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Dorian and Julia had found what so many people searched for but never quite achieved. True partnership, deep love, a family built on mutual respect and genuine affection. They worked hard and prospered, but more importantly, they were happy. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dorian took Julia back to the meadow where he had first found her picking wildflowers. It was June again, and the poppies were in bloom, carpeting the ground in gold just as they had all those years ago. Daniel and Sarah were spending the day with Mrs. Carlyle, giving their parents a rare day alone together. "You remember the first time we came here?" Julia asked, sitting on the blanket Dorian had spread on the ground. "I was so nervous. I could not believe a man like you was interested in a woman like me." "A man like me," Dorian repeated, settling beside her. "I was the lucky one, Julia. I still am. You took a broken, grieving man and helped him learn how to live again. You gave me purpose and hope and a family I treasure more than anything." "You did the same for me," Julia said, taking his hand. "I was barely surviving when you found me. Now I am thriving. We both are." Our children are healthy and happy, our businesses are successful, and we have built a life I could not have imagined in my wildest dreams." Dorian pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, still tinged with wildflowers after all these years. "I love you, Julia Pierce. I loved you the moment I saw you kneeling in this meadow, and I will love you until the day I die." "I love you too," Julia said, tilting her face up for a kiss. "Forever and always." They lay back on the blanket, watching clouds drift across the impossibly blue sky, hands clasped between them. The wildflowers swayed in the breeze, and somewhere nearby a meadowlark sang. It was a perfect moment, one of thousands they had shared and would continue to share in the years to come. The years passed swiftly, marked by the rhythms of family life and the changing seasons. Daniel and Sarah grew from children into teenagers, both inheriting their parents' intelligence and work ethic. Daniel decided he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and become a lawman, while Sarah showed an aptitude for botany that thrilled Julia. In 1900, when Daniel turned 16, Dorian began teaching him the skills he would need for law enforcement. They spent hours at the shooting range on horseback, learning tracking and investigation techniques. Dorian was careful to also teach Daniel about justice and mercy, about the weight of responsibility that came with wearing a badge. He wanted his son to understand that being a lawman was about protecting people, not just enforcing rules. Sarah, at 11, was already helping in her mother's shop and spending hours in the garden learning about different plants and their properties. She had Julia's gentle manner with customers and her father's keen eye for detail. Julia knew her daughter would one day take over Davenport Botanicals, and the thought filled her with pride. In 1902, Dorian and Julia celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. They hosted a party at their home, which they had expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family. Friends and colleagues came from all over the county to celebrate with them. The mayor gave a speech about how the Pierces were pillars of the Chico community, setting an example of what hard work and love could achieve. As Dorian looked around at the crowd of people who had become part of their lives, at his children laughing with their friends, at Julia moving through the guests with grace and warmth, he felt overwhelming gratitude. 20 years ago, he had been a lonely, grieving man going through the motions of living. Now he had everything he had ever wanted and more. That night, after the last guest had left and the children had gone to bed, Dorian and Julia sat on their porch swing, watching the stars come out. Julia rested her head on Dorian's shoulder, his arm around her waist. 20 years, she said softly. It has gone by so fast. And yet it feels like I have known you forever, Dorian replied. Like we were always meant to be together. Maybe we were, Julia said. Maybe that meadow where we met was always our destiny. You found me picking wildflowers and I bloomed in your care just like those flowers. Dorian smiled at the poetic nature of her words. We bloomed together, he corrected. You healed me as much as I helped you. We saved each other. Yes, Julia agreed. We did. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from decades of shared life. Dorian thought about all the moments that had brought them to this point. The first time he saw Julia in the meadow, their first kiss, their wedding day. The births of their children. Thousands of small, ordinary moments that had woven together into a life of extraordinary happiness. In 1904, Daniel graduated from the Law Enforcement Academy in Sacramento and returned to Chico as a deputy marshal working under his father. Dorian was prouder than he could express, watching his son take his oath of office, seeing the determination and integrity in Daniel's eyes. He knew his son would be a good lawman, would make a difference in people's lives. Sarah, at 15, had already decided she wanted to attend the newly established University of California in Berkeley to study botany formally. Julia and Dorian supported her ambitions, proud that their daughter wanted to pursue higher education. It was becoming more common for women to attend university, and they were glad Sarah would have opportunities they had never dreamed of. In 1906, tragedy struck the region when a massive earthquake devastated San Francisco. Chico felt the tremors but suffered minimal damage. However, refugees flooded into the town, fleeing the destruction in the city. Dorian organized relief efforts while Julia opened her shop as a makeshift medical station, treating injuries and providing supplies to those in need. For weeks, the Pierce family worked tirelessly to help the displaced and suffering. Daniel assisted with maintaining order and distributing supplies. Sarah helped her mother prepare remedies and bandages. The experience brought them even closer together, united in purpose and compassion. When the crisis finally passed and life began to return to normal, Dorian and Julia took stock of what they had accomplished. They had helped save lives, had provided comfort to people in their darkest hours. It reminded them of why they did what they did, why service to others was so important. In 1908, Sarah departed for Berkeley to begin her university studies. It was difficult for Julia to let her daughter go, but she was also excited for the opportunities awaiting Sarah. They exchanged letters regularly, and Sarah came home for holidays, always bringing new knowledge and enthusiasm for her studies. That same year, Daniel met a young woman named Clara Montgomery, the new schoolteacher in Chico. Clara was 22, intelligent and kind with dark hair and blue eyes. Daniel was smitten immediately, and Clara seemed equally taken with him. They courted for a year before Daniel asked Dorian's advice about proposing. "Do you love her?" Dorian asked his son. "Really love her the way I love your mother?" "I do," Daniel said without hesitation. "She makes me want to be a better man. She challenges me and supports me and makes me laugh. I cannot imagine my life without her." "Then you have your answer," Dorian said, clasping his son's shoulder. "Ask her to marry you and do everything in your power to make her happy every single day. That is the secret to a good marriage." Daniel proposed to Clara on Christmas Eve, and she accepted. They were married in the spring of 1910, in the same church where Dorian and Julia had married 27 years earlier. It was a joyful occasion, made even more special when Sarah came home from university to be her brother's bridesmaid. In 1911, Julia officially retired from running Davenport Botanicals, though she still spent time in the shop advising and helping when needed. Emma, who had worked for Julia for over 20 years, took over as primary manager. Sarah, having graduated from Berkeley with honors, returned to Chico and assumed responsibility for expanding the business into wholesale production of botanical medicines. Dorian reduced his hours as marshal, training a younger man named Robert Wilson to eventually take over the position. At 54, Dorian was ready to step back and enjoy the life he and Julia had built. They had earned the right to slow down, to spend their days together without the constant demands of work. In the fall of 1911, Clara gave birth to Dorian and Julia's first grandchild, a boy they named Dorian James Pierce. Holding his grandson for the first time, feeling the weight of new life in his arms, Dorian was struck by the circle of existence. He had held his own son this way decades ago, and now here was another generation, carrying their family forward into the future. Julia was equally enchanted with baby Dorian, spending hours at Daniel and Clara's house helping with the baby and offering advice when asked. She loved being a grandmother, loved seeing her son as a father, loved the way their family continued to grow and flourish. In 1913, Sarah surprised everyone by marrying Dr. Frost's nephew, Thomas Frost, who had come to Chico to work with his uncle. Thomas was a botanist as well, and he and Sarah had bonded over their shared interests. The wedding was small and intimate, just family and close friends, exactly what Sarah wanted. By 1914, Dorian had fully retired from his position as marshal, though he still consulted occasionally on difficult cases. He and Julia spent their days tending their garden, visiting with grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. They took trips around California, finally having time to see places they had always wanted to visit. On a warm summer evening in 1915, 32 years after they had first met, Dorian and Julia returned to their meadow one last time. They were older now, their hair gray, their steps slower, but their love was as strong as ever. The wildflowers still bloomed in profusion, painting the landscape in gold and purple. "You remember what you told me on our 10th anniversary?" Julia asked, sitting carefully on the blanket Dorian spread for them. "About how you would love me until the day you died." "I remember," Dorian said, settling beside her with a small grunt. His joints were not what they used to be, but he would not have traded this moment for anything. "I want you to know that I feel the same way," Julia said, taking his hand. "You have given me the most wonderful life, Dorian. You found me when I was lost and alone, and you helped me become who I was meant to be. Every day with you has been a gift." "We gave each other those gifts," Dorian said, squeezing her hand. "We built this life together, Julia. Every joy, every challenge, every moment. We were partners then, and we are partners now. That will never change." "No," Julia agreed, leaning against him. "It will never change." They sat in their meadow as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The wildflowers swayed in the evening breeze, and the scent of California poppies filled the air. Dorian thought about the young deputy marshal he had been, the grieving widower who had stumbled across a woman picking flowers and found his whole world transformed. He thought about Julia, young and struggling, fighting to survive on her own, blooming into the strong, capable woman who had become his wife and partner. Their story had been an unlikely one, but also inevitable. Two people who needed each other, who found each other at exactly the right moment, who chose to build a life based on love and respect and shared dreams. It was not a fairy tale, but something better, something real and lasting. In the years that followed, Dorian and Julia continued to live quietly in Chico, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Daniel and Clara had 2 more children, giving Dorian and Julia 3 grandchildren through them. Sarah and Thomas had twins in 1916, a boy and a girl, bringing the grandchild total to 5. The Pierce family gatherings were loud, chaotic, joyful affairs that filled their home with laughter and love. Davenport Botanicals continued to thrive under Sarah's management, expanding into a small chain of shops throughout Northern California. The business that Julia had started with nothing but knowledge and determination had become a successful enterprise that provided good jobs and important medicines to thousands of people. In 1920, Daniel was elected sheriff of Butte County, following in his father's footsteps. Dorian attended his son's swearing-in ceremony with tears in his eyes, proud beyond words of the man Daniel had become. Clara continued teaching, beloved by generations of students. Sarah and Thomas published several papers on California native plants that were well regarded in academic circles. As the 1920s progressed, Dorian and Julia settled into a comfortable old age. They spent their mornings in the garden, afternoons reading or visiting with friends, evenings on their porch swing watching the sun set. Their love had deepened and matured over nearly 4 decades of marriage, becoming something solid and unshakable, a foundation upon which their entire family was built. In the spring of 1923, on a beautiful April morning, Julia woke feeling tired. She tried to dismiss it as simply the aches and pains of age, but by afternoon she was having trouble breathing. Dorian called for Dr. Thomas Frost, their son-in-law, who examined Julia with growing concern. "Her heart is weak," Thomas told Dorian privately. "I am sorry. There is nothing I can do except make her comfortable. It could be days or it could be months, but the outcome is inevitable." Dorian felt the world tilt beneath him. After all these years, he had somehow convinced himself that he and Julia would go on forever, that their love was strong enough to defeat even death. "How long?" he managed to ask. "I cannot say for certain," Thomas said gently, "but you should prepare yourself. And you should tell her, so she can say her goodbyes." Telling Julia that she was dying was the hardest thing Dorian had ever done, but she took the news with characteristic grace and strength. "We have had 40 wonderful years," she said, taking his hand. "That is more than most people ever get." "I am not afraid, Dorian. I have lived a full, happy life and I am at peace." "I am not ready to lose you," Dorian said, his voice breaking. "I do not know how to exist without you." "You will figure it out," Julia said softly. "You are strong, and you have our children and grandchildren who need you. Promise me you will not give up on life when I am gone. Promise me you will find joy again." "I promise," Dorian said, though he could not imagine keeping that promise. Julia lived for 3 more months, spending her remaining time surrounded by family. Daniel and Sarah came every day, bringing the grandchildren. Clara and Thomas were constant presences. Friends visited regularly, saying their goodbyes to a woman who had touched so many lives. Through it all, Dorian never left Julia's side. He held her hand, reminisced about their years together, told her over and over how much he loved her. When she was too weak to walk, he carried her to the garden so she could see her beloved flowers. When she could no longer eat, he sat with her in silence, his presence comfort enough. On a warm July evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Julia looked at Dorian with eyes that still held love despite her pain. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me, for believing in me, for loving me." "Thank you for choosing me," Dorian replied, tears streaming down his face. "For blessing me with your love. You made my life beautiful, Julia. You were my everything." "I love you," Julia said, her voice barely audible. "Always." "I love you too," Dorian said. "Forever." Julia smiled, squeezed his hand one last time and closed her eyes. She took one more breath, then another, each one slower than the last. Finally, as the last light faded from the sky, she breathed no more. Dorian held her body for hours, unable to let go, unable to accept that his Julia was truly gone. Eventually, Daniel gently led him away, and Clara and Sarah prepared Julia's body. The funeral was held 3 days later, attended by what seemed like half of Chico. Julia had been loved by many, and they all came to pay their respects. They buried her in the town cemetery under a spreading oak tree, with a simple headstone that read, "Julia Davenport Pierce, beloved wife, mother, and friend, 1862 to 1923. Dorian stood at her grave long after everyone else had left, unable to walk away, unable to begin his life without her. The weeks and months that followed were dark ones for Dorian. He moved through his days mechanically, going through the motions of living without really feeling anything. His children worried about him, but nothing they said or did seemed to reach him. He had lost his partner, his love, the woman who had been his everything for 40 years, and the world felt empty without her. Then one day in October, Dorian's oldest grandson, young Dorian, who was now 12, came to visit. He found his grandfather sitting in the garden, staring at nothing, and sat down beside him. "Grandma Julia would be sad to see you like this," the boy said with the directness of youth. "She would want you to remember the happy times, not just be sad about losing her." Dorian looked at his grandson, seeing Julia's honey-colored eyes looking back at him from the boy's young face. "You are right," he said slowly. "She would." "Tell me about when you met her," young Dorian suggested. "Father told me a little, but I want to hear it from you." And so Dorian told his grandson about finding Julia in a meadow picking wildflowers, about how she had bloomed in his care, and how they had built a beautiful life together. As he talked, he found himself remembering not just the loss but the joy. The 40 years of love and laughter and partnership. The family they had created together. The legacy they had left. By the time he finished, both he and his grandson were crying, but they were also smiling. Dorian realized that Julia would indeed want him to focus on the gratitude rather than the grief, to celebrate what they had shared rather than mourning what was lost. "Thank you," Dorian told his grandson. "You reminded me of something important. Your grandmother's love is not gone just because she is. It lives on in me, in your father and aunt, in all of you grandchildren. She is still with us in that way." From that day forward, Dorian began to heal. It was slow and painful, and he never stopped missing Julia, but he learned to live with the loss rather than being consumed by it. He spent time with his grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandmother. He tended the garden they had built together, keeping the flowers blooming in her memory. He wrote in the journal Julia had given him all those years ago, recording their story for future generations. Dorian lived for another 7 years after Julia's death. He remained active and engaged with his family and community, determined to honor his promise to Julia to find joy again. He attended Daniel and Clara's 20th wedding anniversary celebration. He walked Sarah's daughter down the aisle when she married. He held his first great-grandchild, marveling at how their family continued to grow and prosper. On a warm June morning in 1930, Dorian went for a walk through the meadow where he had first met Julia. The wildflowers were in bloom, just as they had been that long-ago day in 1883. He picked some California poppies and sat down on the grass, holding them carefully in his weathered hands. His heart had not been strong for some time, and Dorian knew his days were numbered. But he was not afraid. He had lived a full, rich life beyond anything he could have imagined. He had known true love, had raised good children, had made a difference in his corner of the world. As he sat there surrounded by wildflowers, Dorian felt a sense of peace wash over him. He closed his eyes and thought about Julia, about the day he had found her here, about all the years they had shared. In his mind, he could see her young again, kneeling among the flowers, her face lighting up when she saw him. "I kept my promise," he whispered to the wind. "I found joy again. But I am ready now. I am ready to be with you." Dorian Pierce died there in that meadow, surrounded by the wildflowers he and Julia had loved, a peaceful smile on his face. His children found him hours later, and though they grieved, they also felt grateful. Their father had lived well and died peacefully, exactly as he would have wanted. They buried him next to Julia under the oak tree, his headstone reading Dorian Pierce, beloved husband, father, and friend, 1857 to 1930, reunited with his love. The entire town turned out for his funeral, honoring a man who had served them faithfully for nearly 50 years. The Pierce family continued to thrive long after Dorian and Julia were gone. Daniel served as sheriff for 3 decades before retiring with honors. Sarah's botanical business grew into one of the largest in California. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried on their legacy of service, compassion, and dedication to family. And in Chico, people still told the story of the deputy marshal who found a struggling young woman picking wildflowers in a meadow, and how she had bloomed in his care, transforming both their lives into something beautiful and lasting. It became a legend of sorts, a reminder that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that two broken people could heal each other and build something remarkable together. The meadow where they met was preserved, and future generations of the Pierce family would visit it, picking wildflowers and remembering the couple who had started it all. The love story of Dorian and Julia Pierce lived on, inspiring others to believe in second chances, in the power of kindness, in the possibility of finding hope even in the darkest times. Their story was one of transformation and growth, of two people who found each other when they needed it most and chose to build a life together based on mutual respect, deep love, and shared dreams. It was a story of a cowboy who found a woman picking wildflowers and saw not just who she was, but who she could become with support and belief. It was a story of a woman who took the chances offered to her and bloomed into someone strong and capable and remarkable. Most of all, it was a love story, pure and simple. A reminder that true love is not just about grand gestures and passionate moments, though those have their place. True love is also about partnership and patience, about showing up for each other every single day, about building something meaningful together that lasts long after you are gone. Dorian and Julia Pierce built that kind of love, and their family carried it forward into the future, ensuring that their legacy would never be forgotten. They had found each other in a meadow full of wildflowers, and together they had created something even more beautiful than any flower that ever bloomed. They had created a life filled with love, and that was the greatest achievement of all.